Hey friends, tonight, we're diving into the remarkable resilience of medieval peasants, the quiet heroes who, against all odds, endured some of the harshest winters in recorded history. With no central heating, no wool-lined coats, and no promise of warmth, they survived through sheer grit, clever improvisation, and an unbreakable communal spirit. Before we settle into this icy journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this kind of storytelling. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always a joy to see how far this community reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that comforting white noise, and let's begin. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often think of jousting tournaments, royal banquets, or festive markets. But for the average peasant, winter wasn't a season of merriment, it was a ruthless test of survival. Picture this: you're living in a hut made of mud and sticks, with walls so thin you could hear a squirrel sneeze in the woods. There's no insulation, no proper windows, just a drafty hole patched with animal skin and, certainly no fireplace, thermostat battles, the indoor temperature, just a polite few degrees above the freezing air outside. If the wind was howling and the frost biting, your only consolation was that it might be marginally warmer than being completely exposed. Nights were especially cruel. Darkness enveloped everything. The wind wailed like a hungry ghost, and the hearth, your only real heat source, sputtered weakly, its warmth reaching only those lucky enough to sit inches from the flame. If you were on the far side of the room, you might as well have been camping in the woods with worse snacks. Clothing wasn't much help. Peasants didn't own fur cloaks or fine woolen blankets. If you were lucky, you had a few rough spun tunics and perhaps a cloak that smelled vaguely of livestock. The common strategy: layer everything you own and hope to transform into a walking woolen onion. Spoiler alert, it didn't really work. And forget plush bedding. Most slept on bags of straw or hay thrown on the floor, often crawling with fleas. Beds were a luxury, and comfort was a foreign concept. But the cold wasn't just uncomfortably, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and death by exposure were real threats, especially for children and the elderly. Waking up alive each morning was quietly miraculous, often worthy of celebration, maybe with a not-so-frozen turnip if you were lucky. Survival required creativity. If you think your modern apartment is drafty because a window doesn't seal properly, medieval peasants would laugh if their teeth weren't chattering too hard. Their homes were what historians politely call wattle and daub construction. Thin wooden slats crisscrossed and smeared with a blend of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. Not for fun, but because it was sticky, cheap, and surprisingly effective, at least in theory. These walls, no matter how carefully plastered, were no match for winter storms. The wind slipped through every crack and crevice, whirling through the one-room home like it paid rent. Privacy, none. Warmth, rare. Character building, absolutely. As for roofs, those picturesque thatched coverings, they leaked, sagged, and frequently housed the local wildlife. A quiet dinner could quickly turn into an aerial rodent surprise. Windows, if present at all, were mere slits covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was astronomically expensive, a luxury even many nobles couldn't afford. A peasant was just glad if their cowhide window covering didn't fly off in a snowstorm. Floors, just packed dirt. After a good storm, mud would seep upward from the earth, creating puddles inside your own home. In winter, Each step felt like trudging across a frozen swamp. Cold from above, cold from below, cold from all around. It was a full-body siege against your warmth. Still, peasants adapted. They stuffed moss and old cloth into the gaps, layered the ground with straw or rushes, and huddled close together for warmth. Human insulation at its finest. Some even rubbed animal fat into walls to block drafts. It was as grimy as it sounds, but it helped. In homes where the roof was failing and the floor was half frozen, a bit of sheep grease and laughter could make the difference between enduring and surrendering. But perhaps the cruelest foe was the frozen earth itself. Without true flooring, the chill crept up from beneath, relentless and silent. Straw mats offered some barrier, but they flattened quickly, grew moldy, and needed constant replenishment. Dried rushes helped too, though over time the layers accumulated into soggy nests of decomposing plants, bugs, and mystery organisms. Medieval carpet padding, but with fleas and a strong wet goat scent. Beds, for those lucky enough to have them, offered little escape. They were wooden frames, stuffed with you, guessed it more straw or hay. In some homes, animals were brought inside at night, not out of affection, but because their body heat added a few precious degrees to the room. So when we think of the past, it's worth remembering. Survival wasn't romantic. It was relentless, physical, and daily. Yet the people we now call peasants didn't just endure. They found ways to laugh, love, and build communities despite the hardship. They weren't just survivors. They were innovators, fighters, and quietly fierce in their refusal to give into the cold. So next time your heater breaks and you're reaching for a blanket, remember at least you don't have to smear your walls with dung or sleep on a straw mattress. Beside a go at bet, medieval mattresses weren't exactly known for comfort. Made of straw, hay, or, if you were lucky, old wool. They shifted and crunched with every movement, offering little insulation from the cold seeping up from the frozen earth. Tossing and turning wasn't about finding a better sleeping position. It was a clumsy, desperate effort to keep the blood circulating and to avoid waking up with one side of your body numb from the chill. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't defeat the cold. They endured it awkwardly, uncomfortably, and against all odds. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about one thing: waking up with all your toes still attached. And if you managed that, you were already ahead of the curve. In those brutal winters, the unsung hero of the medieval home wasn't the roof or walls, or even the layers of dirt and dung smeared between the cracks for insulation. It was the hearth, the stubborn, smoky fire pit that stood between survival and silence. It wasn't glamorous. No stone mantle, no chimney, just a pile of rocks or a shallow pit, a few half-burned logs, and smoke. Lots of smoke. In fact, most homes didn't have chimneys at all. Smoke had to find its own way out through holes in the roof, gaps in the walls, or more often than not, straight into your lungs. Breathing wasn't ideal, nor was living long, but on the upside, the constant smoke did an excellent job of chasing off fleas and other pests. Who needed pest control when you were effectively slow cooking yourself like a ham? But the hearth wasn't just for warmth. It was the kitchen, the living room, the light source, and the storytelling corner. It was, quite literally, the heart of the home. People gathered around it to cook, gossip, sing, argue, or simply stare into the flames in silence. Because once the sun went down, there wasn't much else to do. Letting the fire die out overnight wasn't just inconvenient, could be deadly without a steady flame. The cold crept in fast, and rekindling a fire from scratch in a pitch-black freezing home wasn't easy. You didn't have matches. You didn't have lighters. You had flint, steel, brittle fingers, and a few fragile scraps of dry kindling, if you hadn't burned them the night before. Starting a fire in those conditions was half survival, half prayer. So medieval families got clever. They banked the fire. Not in the savings account sense, but by carefully burying the glowing embers beneath a mound of ash before bed. The ash acted like a thermal blanket, trapping heat and keeping the coals alive just enough until morning. If done right, all it took at sunrise was a gentle poke and a bit of fresh wood, and the hearth roared back to life. If done wrong, the fire died in the night, and so might you. Fire banking was a craft, passed from parent to child like a cherished recipe. Everyone had their method. Some swore by dry ash, others believed in a touch of moisture. Some tightly packed the coals, others let them breathe. It was the medieval version of a barbecue argument jest, with slightly higher survival stakes. But even the best plans failed. A sudden gust through a poorly sealed wall could kill the fire. A clumsy sheep could stumble into the hearth and scatter your embers. So some families took turns waking in the night, checking the coals a groggy shuffle through darkness that might have been the first version of walking to adjust the thermostat. Keeping the fire alive wasn't about conquering the elements, it was about delaying defeat, about buying a few more hours of warmth and hope. And if you woke up to a single glowing ember, that wasn't just a good sign, that was victory. When the fire struggled and the wind howled through every crack in the walls, there was one more reliable source of warmth. Each other, the more. The merrier wasn't a party motto, it was a winter strategy. Entire families, sometimes even neighbors and livestock, huddled together in a single warm corner of the house. Privacy didn't exist. Neither did personal space. Not when frostbite was a real possibility. They formed what can only be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagnolade, tangled, half asleep, and fully frozen. Kids nestled between parents, grandparents, curled at the edges. And if Cousin Ethel dropped by unannounced, well, there was always room for one more under the Mathetan blanket. If you were lucky, you got a central spot where body heat radiated from all sides. If not, you ended up at the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping beside an open freezer. Move too much, and you'd knock someone else into the cold draft. By the wall. That was the fastest way to become the family villain. Even bedding was communal. A single straw mattress, flattened from years of use, hosted generations and hygiene. Let's just say the aroma of medieval bedtime wasn't exactly lavender and eucalyptus, but when your only other option was freezing to death, you stopped being picky. Body heat wasn't just cozy, it was tactical. Some guides even advised arranging the strongest and warmest on the outside, like human space heaters, while babies and the elderly were tucked in the center, protected like fragile embers. But over time, this nightly struggle became more than just survival. It became family. It became a connection. Long, dark nights huddled together led to stories, songs, whispered dreams, and the kind of bonding that only emerges when warmth is shared, not just in temperature, but in presence. So the next time you grumble because someone stole your blanket or the dog hogged your bed, just remember at least you're not fighting frostbite in a smoky room, wrapped in damp rags and praying your fire doesn't die before morning. For elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goatif, you thought modern roommates were a challenge. Medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything that breathed and gave off warmth. Bringing animals indoors wasn't some quaint village tradition. It was a survival tactic. In a drafty, barely insulated hut where the wind shrieked louder than your stomach, every degree of heat mattered. Livestock gave off body warmth, and in homes with little between you and the freezing dirt floor, that warmth was as valuable as gold. Plus, keeping your goat inside meant it was far less likely to get stolen in the dead of night. 2 birds, 1 stinky stone. At night, the home transformed into a chaotic furnace of life. Chickens nested in dark corners, pigs snorted contentedly near the hearth, and cows lounged like entitled tenants, chewing cud as if they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous, far from it. Imagine being trapped in a car for hours with someone who hasn't bathed, only that someone is a cow, it's winter, and there's no exit. The smells were legendary. By spring, the perfume of a shared winter could drop a grown man. You didn't need candles, your nostrils were already on a roller coaster of manure, smoke, and whatever the pig dragged in. But medieval noses adapted. Peasants didn't complain because they understood the brutal truth. The more animals indoors, the fewer toes lost to frostbite. Certain animals even got prime spots. Cows, being the largest and warmest, took the honored space near the family. Goats, mischievous and persistent, usually made their way in regardless. Chickens roosted in rafters or baskets, and pigs, bless them, just collapsed wherever they pleased, likely right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing your sleeping quarters with livestock wasn't without hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully only to be woken by a chicken mistaking your hair for a nest, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious on your way to the fire. Medieval mornings had a way of keeping you humble. Still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants knew the simple math. Cold kills, cows cuddle. Whether they wanted to or not, those animals helped families survive winter's merciless grip. Fashion in medieval winters wasn't about looking good, it was about not dying. Peasants weren't chasing trends, they were layering up like soldiers, preparing for a seasonal war. The rule was simple: if you owned it, you wore it often, all at once. First came the linen undertunic, scratchy and rarely clean. Over that, 1 or more woolen tunics, then leggings that sagged and cloaks that scratched. If you had a sheepskin patched, smelly, and heavy, you wore it like armor. Congratulations, you were now 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots, a luxury. Most peasants wrapped their feet in cloth or rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If that didn't stop the cold, you added more rags and prayed your toes didn't turn black. Washing clothes in winter, forget it. That meant hauling your only shirt to a frozen stream, hacking through the ice, and waiting days for it to dry. Assume it didn't freeze solid, so most peasants simply accepted that they'd smell like a mixture of sweat, smoke, and sheep. Oddly enough, this filth became useful. Over time, the grime, sweat, and mud that accumulated on clothing began to act like insulation. It clogged fabric gaps, blocked wind, and trapped body heat. Like medieval Gore-Tex, just with a stench that could knock out a priest. Peasants wore the same layers for weeks, adding new ones on top. Washing was avoided not out of laziness, but because staying dirty meant staying warm. Some even believed washing too often in winter made you sick. The holy filth barrier, as we might call it, was considered a protective shield. Soap was rare and saved for special occasions like weddings, the bishop's visit, or death. Gloves, hats, and scarves were prized. A simple wool cap could mean the difference between waking up or not waking at all. Gloves were patched together from leather scraps and fabric more Frankenstein than fashion statement. Children were swaddled like oversized turnips, waddling stiffly in search of warmth, not style. In a world where everyone smelled equally atrocious, no one noticed or cared. Nose blindness was practically a survival skill. So the next time you complain about putting on a jacket, remember this. Medieval peasants went through winter wearing half their wardrobe at once, smelling like a barn, sleeping beside a goat, and counting themselves lucky for it, because in their world, dirt wasn't a disgraced wassail strategy. Warmth wasn't optional, it was life or death, and the goat, well, at least it wasn't snoring. Failure? No. In the world of medieval peasants, it was fashion. It was fashionable. And if by February you were still walking around with a thick, greasy outer layer, you were winning at life. If you imagine medieval peasants spending winter nights, snuggled in feather beds under embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was far more rustic. By rustic, we mean sleeping on piles of dead plants and hoping you didn't freeze solid by dawn. Beds, if you could call them that, were usually rough wooden frames when you could afford one topped with a large sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or dried rushes. That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic design. Just a crunchy, pokey, slightly moldy bundle that smelled vaguely of barnyard and bad decisions. Every time you turned in your sleep, you were serenaded by the soothing crackle of straw and the occasional jab from a rogue stork. Some peasants skipped the wooden bed frame entirely, tossing straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating what modern influencers might market as earth-connected slumber. The straw wasn't just uncomfortable, it was lived. It flattened fast, collected moisture, grew mold, and welcomed fleas like VIP guests at a tavern. Changing the bedding was a seasonal event, a few times a year if you were particularly diligent, or more commonly, only when the straw started crawling on its own. Rushes offered an alternative. These long grasses were sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to help cover the powerful scent of sweat. Livestock and general hardship. Fresh rushes did smell lovely for about a day. After that, they blended into the household grime, mashed together with dirt, food scraps, and whatever small creatures had wandered in during the night. And speaking of creatures, the straw beds weren't yours alone. Fleas, lice, and all manner of biting bugs made themselves at home in your bedding. If you woke up itching more than sleeping, congratulations, you were living the full, authentic, medieval peasant life. Still, these humble piles of straw were a lifeline. They provided crucial insulation against the frozen ground, and when family members huddled together, they created pockets of body heat. In a world without central heating, that was survival engineering at its finest. So next time you settle into your memory foam mattress, swaddled in softness, just remember somewhere in the long arc of history, a medieval peasant is looking down at you, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth, whispering, "Must be nice." Now, when your home is made of sticks, mud, and wishful thinking, winter breezes aren't just annoying, they're acts of war. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the cold outside their homes, they fought a war inside, with whatever scraps they could find to keep the frost at bay. And trust me, there were a lot of gaps to fill. Walls warped, mud cracked, thatched roofs sagged. The wind didn't just sneak in, it announced itself like an uninvited guest, howling through every crevice. Sealing up your house became an annual art form. Gaps were stuffed with moss, straw, scraps of cloth, tufts of animal hair, anything soft and squishable. If it could block a breeze, it had a place in the wall. Some especially dedicated folks added fresh layers of daub mud mixed with straw and manure over the walls each winter. Picture standing outside in freezing temperatures, slapping cold dung onto your house, muttering, "This is fine. This is luxury." And honestly, in their world, it was. Roofs were another battlefield. Thatched roofing was common, cheap, and abundant, but far from waterproof. After a few winters, they leaked like sieves. Peasants patched them with scraps of cloth, bundles of reeds, or, in more desperate moments, hunks of turf stolen from nearby fields. After a while, most peasant homes looked like patchwork shelters built by someone with more hope than materials. Doors and windows, if you had them at all, they were rudimentary wooden planks nailed into place with iron and determination. Window holes were usually covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out drafts. Bonus, it also gave your home a lovely background scent of smoked meat and despair. Every night became a tactical skirmish between human creativity and the creeping cold. One moment you were warm, the next a sharp gust would find that one crack you missed and slap you awake like a frosty hand of doom. But through ingenuity, stubbornness, and sheer willpower, peasants patched, jammed, and sealed their way through winter's worst, one frozen handful at a time. And when the cold truly bit, when sleep was a gamble and the fire threatened to fade into embers, peasants had a final strategy: sleeping in shifts. This wasn't some orderly military operation with bells and whistles. It was raw necessity. Half the household would stay up tending the fire, patching leaks, and jamming cloth into new drafts. The other half curled up under scratchy blankets and hay, hoping to grab a few hours of rest before being nudged awake to take their turn. Fires were lifelines. Left unattended, they would die, and reigniting them from scratch was no small feat. So families took turns. You'd nap for a bit, then drag yourself groggily to the hearth to stoke the coals, mumbling curses and trying not to trip over a chicken. The cycle continued all night. Kids old enough to hold a stick, draft patchers, grandparents, they often stayed near the fire the longest, not just because of experience, but because getting up from the floor once they lay down was a full-body event. And sleep itself, it was fleeting, fragile, and constantly interrupted by footsteps, wind, goats, or the sharp elbow of a snoring sibling. But the system worked. Barely, but it worked. Through this constant vigilance, the embers survived, and with them, the family did too. So next time you're up at 3 a.m., cranky and cold because your heater's too loud or the blanket slipped off, just remember, a medieval peasant survived worse while sleeping next to a goat, covered in straw, wrapped in a cloak that smelled like damp moss and determination. Before you complain about getting up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant crouched in the darkness at 3 a.m., poking at a smoking ember and wondering if losing a toe or two might actually be worth a few more minutes of sleep. In winter, it wasn't just the cold air they had to battle, it was how they breathed. You know it's cold when even your breath needs strategy. Deep, open-mouthed, inhaling drew in air that felt like knives to the lungs, and in a world without antibiotics, pneumonia could kill you faster than you could mutter a Hail Mary. So peasants adapted. They learned to breathe like their lives depended on it, because they did. Instead of gasping in great lungfuls of icy air, they practiced shallow, steady nasal breathing, carefully warming each breath as it entered. It wasn't perfect, but it reduced the risk of coughing yourself into an early grave. A single mistake, one open-mouthed gulp of Coldest, you might earn yourself a week of bone-rattling coughs, fever dreams, and a treatment plan consisting of hot onion tea and whispered prayers from grandma. Some peasants even slept with bits of cloth, shawls, or rags pulled up over their mouths, crude but effective breath warmer. Of course, by morning, that cloth was a damp, freezing rag clinging to your face. Still, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught this early. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs during cold months. Between breath control, itchy wool layers, and sharing a bed with a goat that had no sense of decency, medieval winters made for character-building childhoods like no other. At night, under musty cloaks and straw bedding, next to a snoring sibling or a steaming cow, breathing became an art form, silent, minimal, nose only. Like a grim medieval yoga retreat, only colder and with fewer mantras. But it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants clawed through another long night in the unending war against winter. And as strange as it sounds, one of their best defenses against the cold wasn't found in fabric or fire, it was food. Yes, warmth came from within, literally. A full belly was as good as an extra blanket. The more calories your body had to process, the more heat it generated. It was basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat big, stay warm. So, before bed, peasants piled their plates with whatever could stick to their ribs and burn slow. Think thick stews made from root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Hearty grains like oats or barley porridge, and hunks of dense rye. Bread that could double as roof tiles. On lucky nights after a festival or a generous slaughter, you might even get a morsel of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage stirred into the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the modern sense. There were no garnishes, no Instagrammable plating. Just a bowl of vaguely brown, heavy fare designed to anchor your insides and keep your body smoldering through the cold. It wasn't about eating a lot, it was about eating smart. Foods rich in fat and complex carbs burned slowly, giving off steady internal heat. A belly full of stew, bread, and mystery lard. That was peak winter luxury. Children were expected to eat, picky or not. Didn't like turnips. Tough. You either finished your bowl or shivered all night long, wishing you had. Of course, heavy eating before sleep had its drawbacks. The warmth came at a cost. Vivid, bizarre dreams as your digestive system battled an entire cabbage patch in the dark. Still, better weird dreams than waking up frozen solid. And food wasn't the only trick in their survival playbook. Enter two of the least glamorous but most effective tools of medieval winter survival: the haybox and the heated stone. The haybox was exactly what it sounds like, a sturdy wooden box lined with hay. At first, it was used to keep cooked food warm without using more firewood. Stew or porridge would go in hot, get buried in hay, and stay warm for hours. But soon, peasants realized something else. If hay could hold a pot's heat, maybe it could hold other heat, too. That's where the heated stone came in. Each night, someone, usually the youngest child, thanks to the democratic miracle of being smallest, was tasked with tossing a flat stone into the heart of the hearth. Once the stone was good and hot, it would be retrieved with a stick or iron, tongs hopefully without third-degree burns, then wrapped in cloth or placed inside a pot. That smoldering stone would be slipped under the bedding, tucked into hay, or nestled at the foot of the mattress. Congratulations, you now have a medieval heating pad. If you wrapped it wrong, you got a bonfire. If you dropped it on your foot, you got a winter injury. But if you got it right, that stone stayed warm for hours, radiating comfort like a little sun inside your straw-filled bed. It wasn't plush, it wasn't fancy, but when the wind howled through every wall and frost laced your beard by dawn, that stone felt like salvation. In the hierarchy of winter survival, the hearth reigned supreme, but its helpers, the haybox and heated stone, played their part. Together with full bellies, controlled breaths, and crowded beds, they formed the medieval answer to central heating. So next time you tuck in under your electric blanket, thermostat set to your exact preference, think of the peasant curled beneath a scratchy wool cloak, nose buried in a damp rag, stomach full of turnips, and one warm stone keeping the darkness at bay, and be grateful. Asterisk, the closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. Medieval sleeping arrangements weren't about comfort or personal preference. They were about survival logistics. Infants, the elderly, and anyone weak or sick claimed the best spots closest to the flames. Everyone else fanned out from their inconcentric rings of human insulation, forming a living defense line against the cold. These prime-emphasized spots weren't assigned out of sentimentality, they were critical calculations. Babies were delicate heat radiators. Elders were treasured holders of memory, experience, and let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them wasn't optional, it was a communal instinct. But being near the fire didn't mean comfort. Too close, and you risked singed hair or a cloak catching fire in your sleep. Too far, and you might as well have slept outside. The trick was finding that narrow middle ground, close enough to survive, not so close you woke up smelling like smoked pork. The fire's heat didn't travel far or evenly. It roasted the shins of whoever sat directly in front, while everyone else huddled around the fading heat like cold-blooded lizards scrambling for a rare beam of sun. If you managed to fall asleep facing the fire, you might enjoy one toasty side while the other turned into a meat popsicle. Animals, naturally, joined the pile. A dog might sneak in, curling between you and the hearth, tail wagging dangerously. Close-tough, open flame. Chickens perched on warm hearthstones like tiny, feathery guardians, clucking softly in their sleep. Every spark, every hiss of shifting logs was a whispered promise. You're still alive, you're still warm. For now. In the still dark, peasants drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep wrapped in layers of wool and smoke, breathing out visible clouds of warmth. Beyond the fragile circle of firelight, winter waited, patient and cruel. But inside that flickering halo of survival, they clung to life. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone unless they wanted to end up as a very stylish, frozen statue by January. Survival was a village affair, messy, loud, unpredictable, but absolutely vital. If a neighbor's fire went out, someone noticed. If the morning smoke didn't rise from a chimney, someone checked in. Not always out of pure goodwill. Sometimes it was because old Tom still owed them a chicken. But mostly because community meant survival. Villagers had informal winter watchers, usually the elderly or young, who couldn't work the fields but could keep tabs on who hadn't been seen, who was coughing too hard, or whose home looked too quiet. Think of them as a medieval neighborhood watch, minus the vests, plus a lot more sheep. If someone's hearth went cold, it was a near emergency. A good neighbor might rush over with a glowing ember wrapped in rags. Better yet, they'd offer space in their already cramped hut for the night. Yes, that meant squeezing another 4 freezing bodies into a smoky room already packed with kids, goats, and gossip, but it was better than finding a frozen friend come spring thaw. Communal food stores often played their part. In the worst winters, villagers pooled the last of their salted meat, dried vegetables, and grain. It wasn't charity, it was survival math. No one had much, but a few shared meals could be the difference. Between seeing spring or not, even children understood the stakes. They fetched wood, carried hot coals, and delivered messages between homes. No one was too small or tired when winter came pounding at the door. Sure, medieval villages weren't perfect. Feuds over land, goats, or who ruined the good cooking. Pots simmered endlessly. But when the temperature dropped, grudges often froze solid too. Because in that season, even your least favorite neighbor was a life worth saving. Tomorrow, it might be you knocking at their door. In winter's icy grip, the village became one big, dysfunctional, but determined family bound together by muddy boots, crackling fires, and the stubborn will to endure. They didn't just fight back with cloaks and embers, they prayed. When the fire dimmed and the wind howled like wolves beyond the thin timber walls, peasants turned to faith, not as decoration, but as necessity. Prayer was warmth. Prayer was armor. Every night, families knelt by the hearth, whispering desperate pleas for survival, not for riches or miracles, just to make it to morning with the roof intact and their toes still attached. Saints became frontline defenders. Saint Blaise was invoked to ward off throat infections, no small matter when one icy breath could send you coughing up blood. Saint Nicholas, long before Coca-Cola rebranded him, was called upon to shield homes from ruin during the harshest months. Superstition added layers of spiritual insulation. Some sprinkled holy water around the hearth before sleep to repel both evil spirits and errant draughts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after feast days, hoping warmth and luck would enter and stay. Candles were more than light, they were silent prayers. Some were blessed by priests, others by the village's most devout elder. Either way, they were kept burning through the night, like a fragile line of defense against the gnawing dark. And of course, no winter prayer session was complete without promises. Dear Lord, if we survive this night, I swear I'll stop cursing my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't abstract. It was a daily, desperate conversation with whatever higher power might be listening through the snow. But for all their cleverness, grit, and hope, sometimes it wasn't enough. When winter won, it didn't take just one or two. It swallowed entire families, even whole villages buried beneath silence, snow, and time. Some winters were especially cruel, like in 1315, when relentless rains ruined the harvest. Livestock died in droves, and famine spread like frostbite. Those were the winters that didn't just leave scars. They left empty homes, forgotten names, and stories that ended too soon. And yet each spring that followed, someone always emerged from the thaw, muddy and starving but alive. The fire might be low, their village is smaller, but hope remained. Hope and a very judgmental goat still standing by the hearth, wondering what took you so long. Freezing temperatures didn't just make life harder in medieval times, they turned an already brutal existence into a slow, grinding disaster. When winter came, survival wasn't a given. It was a desperate gamble. People grew so hungry, so exhausted, that stories began to circulate quiet. Grim tales whispered over cold hearths of chewing leather, stripping bark from trees, and, in the most horrifying cases, consuming each other. Failure to keep the fire alive wasn't just an inconvenience, it was often a death sentence. Without that weak but vital heat from the hearth, entire families would curl up together for the last time, hoping their shared body warmth might carry them through. Sometimes it didn't. Neighbors would stumble upon homes in the spring, silent and still, their inhabitants frozen in each other's arms, locked in one final attempt to survive just a little longer. Houses collapsed under the weight of snow. Roofs caved in during ice storms. If the roof gave way in the middle of the night, it was rarely survivable, trying to trek through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbors. That was no guarantee either, especially when every family was stretched to the edge themselves. And the cold didn't kill alone, it brought disease with it. Starvation weakened the body, and the cramped, smoky huts turned into breeding grounds for illness, pneumonia, bronchitis. Infections that started as a cough in December often became funerals by January. Then there was the quiet horror of frostbite. Fingers, toes, ears blackened, dying while still attached. Some villagers made it to spring, but left pieces of themselves behind. Surviving winter meant paying a toll. I lived, they're missing. Fingers said, but winter took a part of me. Yet what's most haunting isn't just the death, it's how normal it was. People didn't cry out in surprise when winter claimed another life, it was expected. Like a shadow at the edge of the village, death was always waiting. Not cruel, not merciful, just patient. Still, even amid the biting cold, medieval peasants pressed on, grieving, working, enduring, because as long as there was a single ember in the hearth, a single breath hanging in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. When we look back at medieval peasants, the frostbitten, survivors of so many endless winters, it's easy to see only the hardship, the cracked hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-choked huts. But beneath all that suffering was something more powerful, an unbreakable legacy of resilience. They didn't have central heating. They didn't have fleece-lined coats, or thick socks, or steaming mugs of comfort. They didn't even have the certainty they'd live to see the thaw. What they did have was ingenuity, determination, grit passed down through blood and cold and time. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every hand-banked fire, every moss-backed wall was a defiant act of survival. They didn't break, they adapted, they watched. They learned from the land, from each other, from the long, cruel memory of winters that came before. Their strength wasn't built in solitude. It came from the community. They shared food, watched over Thesic, and taught each other to prepare. They knew no one survives winter alone. Even their faith was a kind of endurance. They prayed, not just in fear, but in hope. Fragile, stubborn hope. That tomorrow might be warmer. That spring would return. That life would bloom again through frozen ground. And somehow it did. Because of their sacrifices. Because of their unglamorous victories. One more night. One more storm. Bit by frozen bit, they moved humanity forward. Until the warmth we now take for granted became an expectation, not a miracle. Every cozy blanket, every heated room, every lazy winter evening spent sipping tea beneath soft lights is built on their refusal to give up. So the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, spare a thought for them, the nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a legacy. One ember, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. Anne Boleyn didn't enter the world with a crown on her head or an army at her back. She was born around 1501, likely at Blicklen Hall or Hever Castle, the daughter of Thomas Bullen, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman of powerful lineage. Her birth caused little stir in the grand halls of Tudor society. Yet from these modest beginnings, something extraordinary began to grow. Anne wasn't marked for greatness by wealth, but by wit. Sharp, spirited, and undeniably magnetic. She stood out not because she was expected to, but because she refused not to. Recognizing her potential, her family sent her abroad. Her education began in the polished courts of Europe, a rare privilege. For an English girl, first she served Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, absorbing the rhythm of diplomacy and the unspoken codes of courtly life. There, Anne began to understand power not as brute force, but as presence. But it was in France that Anne truly came into her own. She spent years at the courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, immersed in the elegance and intellect of the French Renaissance. While other young women mastered embroidery, Anne studied the art of conversation, the quiet weapons of charm, wit, and mystery. She learned how to command attention without appearing to seek it. Her beauty was debated, but her presence wasn't. When she returned to England in the early 1520s, she was no longer a girl. She was something rarer. A woman forged by Europe, fluent in its culture, and ambitious in ways few dared to be. She could stand in a room of courtiers and outshine them or not with jewels, but with fire behind the eyes. She wasn't conventionally beautiful. Even her admirers said so. But she was arresting dark eyes that hinted at secrets, a voice that danced with intelligence, and a posture that suggested she knew exactly what she wanted and precisely how to get it. Anne didn't enter rooms. She shifted their gravity. At a time when women were expected to drift quietly into marriage or fade behind the walls of domestic life, Anne refused. She had seen the power that charm and intellect could wield in foreign courts, and she intended to use that knowledge at home. She was still young, still untested, but history was beginning to stir around her, because the woman who had returned from France was no longer just Thomas Bullen's daughter. She was now a forcer player in a game that would soon consume the entire English crown in a world of pale-faced, modest English roses. Anne Boleyn was a thunderstorm-charged, unpredictable and impossible to ignore. Her dark hair, piercing eyes, and razor-sharp wit set her apart from the gentle, obedient women who graced the court of King Henry VIII. At first, she played her part a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence glowed like a candle too fierce to snuff out. She danced with elegance, spoke French as fluently as a Parisian, and laughed with a confidence few women dared to show. Men took notice. Women whispered. The court buzzed with quiet speculation about the striking Boleyn girl. And soon, she caught the most dangerous eye of all the kings. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirtation. His court thrived on secret liaisons and whispered promises. But Anne was different. She didn't melt at his compliments or rush into his arms like others had. She held her ground. She teased, challenged, and refused. Henry, a man used to instant devotion, was enthralled. The more Anne kept him at a distance, the deeper he sank. Letters passed between them full of longing, frustration, and adoration. Henry offered her the role of royal mistress, the most powerful, unofficial title a woman could hold at court. Anne stunned everyone. She said no. She would not be another passing affair, a name forgotten in royal ledgers. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her his queen. It was a bold gamble, almost unthinkable. The king was already married. Queen Catherine was beloved, respected, and protected fiercely by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. To make Anne his wife, Henry would have to defy the church, abandon his queen, and risk igniting a political firestorm. But Anne did not waver. She had spent years in the glittering courts of Europe, where queens ruled from behind silk fans and delicate smiles. She understood the danger of ambition, but she also knew how to play the game. And she intended to win. Standing in the candlelit corridors of the English court, Anne Boleyn chose not just admiration, but transformation. Not just for herself, but for England. What began as courtly flirtation soon spiraled into a crisis that shook a kingdom. Henry's infatuation with Anne became obsession, and in his desperation to marry her, he was willing to dismantle centuries of tradition. The problem: he was already bound in matrimony to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, dignified and unyielding, refused to step aside. She had been Henry's faithful wife for 2 decades. In the eyes of the church and the people, she was England's true queen. Divorce was not only scandalous, it was nearly impossible. But Henry, increasingly convinced that his marriage was cursed, since Catherine had once been wed to his brother, Arthur, insisted it had never been valid. He claimed his soul was at risk unless the union was annulled, even though the Pope had blessed it years before. Anne, for her part, walked to razor's edge. She played the role of distant prize encouraging, but never yielding. Every smile was deliberate. Every glance is a calculated risk. She was no longer just a courtier seeking love. She was positioning herself for a crown. The court fractured. Some nobles sought Anne's favor, sensing the shift in power. Others remained loyal to Catherine, appalled at Anne's ascent. Foreign ambassadors penned anxious letters home. Monarchs abroad issued threats. Even Henry's most trusted advisors grew uneasy as the king's desires collided with the immovable authority of Rome. Catherine had powerful allies, none greater than her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most dominant ruler in Europe. Yet Henry pressed on. He bombarded the Pope with demands. He ordered lawyers to dig up loopholes, and gradually he realized something extraordinary. If the church would not bend, he would break from it. Anne wasn't just captivating a king, she was leading an entire kingdom into uncharted waters, and there was no turning back. After nearly 7 years of scandal, strategy, and political turmoil, Anne Boleyn's wager succeeded. In January 1533, she secretly married Henry, though in the eyes of the Pope and much of Europe, he remained married to Catherine. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a dazzling ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the pinnacle of her life, but the atmosphere was far from celebratory. Londoners watched the coronation with mixed emotions. Some cheered, others wept for Catherine. Many muttered prayers, unsure if the new queen was England's blessing or its undoing. Anne had not entered her queenship on a wave of adoration, but as a storm. Unlike Catherine, who embodied piety and humility, Anne dazzled with style and intelligence. She wore vivid colors, wielded court politics with skill, and made enemies with stunning speed. Her position, while glittering, was never secure. Everything depended on one thing: a male heir, and knew it. Henry knew it. The entire realm knew it. Her womb held the future of the Tudor dynasty. When Anne became pregnant, the court rejoiced. Henry was confident it would be a son. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Anne hid her disappointment behind poise. She promised the next child would be a boy, but Henry's joy dimmed. The man who had once rewritten a nation to have her now looked at Anne with a flicker of doubt. Still, for a time, her star blazed. She remade the court in her image. Her family rose to dizzying heights. Foreign ambassadors scrambled to curry favor. Even the sacred oil used in her coronation, a ritual traditionally reserved for kings, marked her unprecedented power. Most monumental of all, Henry severed England from Rome. The Church of England was born, with the king himself at its head, all to secure Anne's place and validate her crown. But beneath the triumph, tension brewed. Allies became cautious. Rivals grew bolder. Whispers returned. And Henry, fickle, moody, began to look beyond the brilliant woman who had turned his world upside down. Anne had changed England, but the kingdom she had helped to reshape now held its breath. And the storm that had risen with her ascent was far from over. Anne Boleyn had won the throne, but keeping it would require more than charm, ambition, or even love. She had risen higher than nearly any woman of her time, capturing the heart of a king and reshaping the destiny of a kingdom. But in the brutal theatre of Tudor politics, the higher the ascent, the more devastating the fall. Almost from the moment she placed the crown upon her head, the cracks began to show. At the center of Anne's struggle was one brutal truth: she had to produce a male heir. Her first child, Elizabeth, bright, healthy, and sharp, was not the son Henry VIII had staked his dynasty upon, and the clock was ticking. Anne suffered multiple pregnancies in rapid succession. Each ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, each one leaving her physically weakened, emotionally battered, and politically vulnerable. With every lost child, the foundation of her power crumbled further. Henry, once maddened with desire for her, began to withdraw. The passion that had fueled a schism with Rome now cooled into disappointment and resentment. An outspoken, proud, and unwilling to submit, argued, pleaded, and fought to hold her ground. But Henry, a man who prized obedience as much as beauty, began to chafe under her sharp tongue and fierce intellect. The very fire that had once captivated him now burned too hot. Outside the royal bedchamber, wolves gathered. Many nobles, who had watched Anne's rise with clenched jaws and silent rage, now schemed openly for her downfall. Supporters of Catherine of Aragon never forgave what they saw as Anne's theft of the crown and her role in the king's great betrayal. Among the common people, she became a figure of contempt, blamed for England's break with the church and for the heavy-handed religious upheavals that followed. And then came Jane Seymour, quiet, demure, the living opposite of Anne. Where Anne had dazzled Henry with wit and defiance, Jane soothed him with gentleness and submission. It was a dangerous contrast. Anne, perceptive as ever, saw the shift. She tried desperately to reclaim her place, lavishing Henry with attention, promising sins, and begging for patience. But it was too late. The king, ever fickle, had already begun imagining life without her. Thomas Cromwell, once her trusted ally in the Reformation, saw the changing winds. Their partnership had always been pragmatic, built on shared ambition. But now Anne's reformist ideals, supporting the poor, challenging corrupt nobles, interfered with Cromwell's pursuit of stability and royal favor. She had become inconvenient. Worse, she had become expendable. And Cromwell, master of silent destruction, moved first. He knew Henry wanted out, but divorce would be a public admission of failure. So Cromwell offered an alternative: disgrace. Elimination through scandal, not legality. The accusations were outrageous: adultery, incest, high treason, and conspiracy. against the king, Anne Boleyn, proud, untouchable, was to be cast as a seductress, a traitor, and a danger to the crown she had once redefined. Cromwell worked in the shadows, coaxing confessions under torture, twisting harmless flirtations into damning charges. Several men were arrested, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The evidence was contradictory, the timeline impossible. But in Henry's court, truth bent to the needs of power. Anne fought back. She appealed to Henry's memory, to the love they had once shared. But the man who had torn a kingdom in two for her now refused even to look her in the eye. In May of 1536, she was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the great iron gates closed behind her, Anne understood. She was no longer queen, she was a prisoner, a pawn in a deadly game she had once played with unmatched brilliance. Now betrayal had taken the throne, and she waited for the final move. Anne stood in the great hall of the Tower, facing a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their very fortunes to her rise. Now they sat coldly in judgment, preparing to erase the woman who had once redefined England's destiny. The charges were staggering: adultery with multiple men including her own brother, high treason, and conspiracy to kill the king. In another world, these accusations against a crowned queen would have been unthinkable. But here, in Henry's court, they were nothing more than theatre, grim spectacle staged to give his vengeance the appearance of justice. Anne defended herself with the same intelligence and fire that had once captured a king's heart. She denied every charge with poise and precision. She reminded them that she had been anointed with sacred oil, chosen by God to be queen. She spoke of her loyalty, her sacrifices, and her love. Her composure stunned even her enemies, but it did not matter. The verdict had been written before the trial even began. Witnesses, many coerced or bribed, gave testimony riddled with contradictions. The dates didn't match. The claims were barely plausible. But truth had long since left the room. Anne Boleyn was found guilty. Her brother George and the other accused men were sentenced to death. Anne too would be executed, but by beheading, a final act of mercy in a court where mercy had vanished. She was given the French executioner, quick, precise, and foreign. Perhaps an echo of the woman she had once been, cultured, dazzling, and dangerous. As the sentence was read, Anne stood tall. She had been the queen who defied a church, a continent, and a king. She had shattered expectations, wielded intelligence like a blade, and briefly, gloriously, ruled the heart of England. But in the end, her fire, her ambition, and her refusal to bow had been the very things that sealed her fate. The woman for whom Henry had risked everything would now pay the ultimate price for daring to be more than just his consort. And as Anne Boleyn prepared to meet her end, she did so with dignity, courage, and the unshakable knowledge that while the world might silence her, history would never forget her. She did not break. She stood tall, her face pale, but her spirit fiercely intact. In those final moments before being led back to her cell, she spoke clearly, declaring that she was prepared to die, and prayed that God would have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors of the hall closed behind her, the court exhaled in relief. The storm had been brilliant, dangerous, and unforgettable. It was nearly over. But even then, they did not understand. They were not erasing Anne Boleyn. They were immortalizing her, in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After her trial, Anne Boleyn was returned to the Tower of London, not as the triumphant queen who had once commanded England, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting death. Yet even facing the end, Anne refused to crumble. In the cold, echoing halls of the tower, she prepared herself. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the hard stone floors, her hands clasped tightly, her voice steady. She confessed to no crimes because she believed she had committed none. "I am not afraid to die," she said, but she prayed that her death would bring peace to the kingdom, and perhaps mercy to her little daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies, few who had stayed loyal, wept in private. Anne comforted them, instead of the other way round. She joked bitterly at times that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In her dark humor was the stubborn spark that had made her unforgettable. Henry VIII, meanwhile, showed no sign of mercy. He had already turned his attention to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date was finalized, Henry was arranging his next marriage. For Anne, this final betrayal from the man who had once torn down a kingdom for her had been the deepest cut. On May 18, 1536, Anne was told she would die the next morning. She slept little that night. Instead, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and perhaps for herself, for the ambition and pride that had led her here. Henry, with a flicker of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution. Faster, cleaner, less brutal than an axe. A small mercy bot, perhaps more for the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort. At dawn, Anne dressed carefully for her final moment. A dark grey gown of damask, trimmed with fur. A crimson kirtle beneath. Colors of dignity, of sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair and tucked it beneath a simple cap, ready to face the blade with grace. As the tower's cold morning mist curled around the courtyard stones, Anne Boleyn, mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward. There would be no tears, no pleas, only a final act of courage in the face of history's judgment. Her end was near, but her story was just beginning. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold built within the Tower of London's walls. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, all wrapped in silence, as if even the stone walls held their breath. Anne stood tall, her grey gown fluttering slightly in the cold morning breeze. She looked thinner than she had at court, her face pale but calm. There were no hysterics, no broken sobs. If anything, she faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once shaken a kingdom to its knees. She spoke briefly, carefully choosing her final words. She did not accuse, she did not defend herself. She prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who had abandoned her. In those final moments, Anne offered the world not a confession, but forgiveness. Her courage stunned even those who had come to see her fall. The French executioner brought specially to ensure a swift death stepped forward. Anne knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer, her eyes lifted toward the heavens. A small white cloth was tied around her eyes. She remained still. The sword flashed once, silent, swift, and Anne Boleyn, Queen Mother, history maker, was no more. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds, laid to rest in a narrow chest because no proper coffin had been prepared for her. A queen once crowned in gold, now left to vanish without ceremony. Yet Anne's story didn't end in that cold grave. Her daughter, Elizabeth, a child whose birth had once disappointed a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose reign would see the flowering of English art, power, and global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unyielding resilience. Anne Boleyn changed the course of England forever. Her ambition helped trigger the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. Her fall showed the world that even queens could be cast aside. Yet through her blood, through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy blazed brighter than any crown she had worn in life. In the end, Anne Boleyn won a kind of immortality not through survival, but through her indelible impact on history. A secretive, fiery group of patriots had grown louder and bolder by 1770. Tensions finally exploded into bloodshed when British soldiers opened fire on unarmed civilians in what would become known as the Boston Massacre. The cobblestones of Boston were already stained with blood. Trust had vanished. By 1773, the colonies stood on the edge of rebellion. A final insult would push them into open defiance. But it didn't come in the form of soldiers, new laws, or armies. It came quietly in the unassuming shape of crates stacked high with tea. The colonists didn't know it yet, but the night that tea floated in the icy waters of Boston Harbor, the world would change forever. That year, Parliament made a critical miscalculation. Believing the American colonies would accept cheaper tea without protest, they passed the Tea Act, a law designed to rescue the struggling British East India Company and, at the same time, reassert Britain's right to tax the colonies. On paper, it seemed like a generous offer. The Tea Act allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonists, cutting out middlemen, slashing prices, and offering a luxury product at a bargain. A few pennies cheaper. What could go wrong? Everything, because the issue was never the price of tea. Tea was the principle. The Tea Act left the hated tax intact. Accepting the tea, even at a discount, would mean acknowledging Parliament's right to tax without consent. To many Americans, that was unthinkably a betrayal of the liberties they had defended for over a decade. News of the Tea Act swept through the colonies like wildfire. Merchants fumed. They saw their livelihoods threatened by a monopoly that would crush local trade. Patriots raged at the deeper message. The Crown still believed it could do whatever it pleased. In Boston, the reaction was especially fierce. A city already scarred by massacre and economic hardship recognized the Tea Act for what it was, a trap disguised as a bargain. Refusing the tea became a matter of honor, a litmus test of loyalty to liberty. Public meetings erupted. Newspaper columns burned with fiery rhetoric. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and others, organized widespread boycotts. They vowed no East India Company tea would be unloaded, sold, or drunk on American soil. Across the colonies, tea ships were turned away by furious resistance from New York to Charleston. The message was clear: we will not be bought. But Boston's fate unfolded differently. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived and anchored in the harbor, and there they stayed, refusing to depart. Royal officials demanded the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused. A deadlock gripped the city like a clenched fist. The tension was unbearable. A single act would break it, and history would never be the same. As the British tea ships floated stubbornly in the harbor, Boston itself became a powder keg. Every passing day without resolution drew the noose tighter. The city wasn't just resisting anymore, it was preparing for war. In taverns, churches, and public squares, angry colonists debated their options. The Sons of Liberty, led by the fierce voices of Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved quickly. They posted public notices urging citizens to boycott British tea. They held massive, raucous meetings packed with farmers, artisans, and merchants. Each gathering added fuel to the fire. The Old South Meeting House became the movement's nerve center. Thousands crammed into the wooden hall, their breath misting. The cold air, their voices rising in defiance. Here, resolutions were passed, speeches made, and tempers ignited. Each vote against unloading the tea-hammered British authority further. But time was running out. British law required that imported goods like tea be unloaded and taxed within 20 days of arrival. If the ships remained after the deadline, customs officials could seize the cargo, and the tax would be collected by force. The Sons of Liberty understood, once that tax was paid even under protests, the principle was lost. This wasn't about tea anymore. It was about whether the colonies would accept being ruled without rights, or stand and fight for their future. Meanwhile, Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson dug in. He refused to let the ships leave without unloading their cargo. He demanded the law be enforced, colonial outrage be damned. To him, backing down would mean admitting that mobs, not monarchs, ruled the colonies. Boston's standoff became a spectacle. Every man, woman, and child sensed that something was coming. You could feel it in the air, that cold, sharp pressure. Before a storm, when the world holds its breath. And somewhere in those crowded streets, among those beating hearts, a decision was taking shape, a plan that would echo across oceans and empires. December 16, 1773, a grey, cold dawn broke over Boston, a city poised on the edge of history. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships had sat in the harbor like ticking bombs. Now the final deadline had come. British law was clear. The tea must be loaded and the tax paid. If not, the cargo would be seized and troops might be summoned. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea came ashore, the principle was lost. If colonists accepted it even once, their entire cause, their claims to liberty would begin to unravel. That morning, thousands of Boston's citizens and nearby colonists packed into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Some walked miles through icy roads to be there. The hall was so crowded that men spilled out into the streets, straining to hear fiery speeches echo through the wooden rafters. Samuel Adams, the iron voice of rebellion, presided. One by one, speakers rose to denounce the Tea Act, to condemn tyranny, and to urge immediate action. But even in that chorus of defiance, uncertainty lingered. What could be done without inviting war? How could they stop the tea without triggering brutal retaliation? As the afternoon wore on, riders galloped in with grim news. Governor Hutchinson would not yield. The ships would not leave. The tea would be seized. The tax would be collected. The king's law would be enforced. The crowd buzzed with fury. The walls of the meeting house seemed to shake with the force of it. And yet Samuel Adams stood calmly and spoke the words that signaled the end of debate. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. A simple sentence, but everyone knew what it meant. There would be no more petitions, no more compromises. Action would be taken outside the law. A war whoop split the cold air. The signal had been given. Men moved fast, transforming themselves with soot-blackened faces, rough blankets, and crude feathers in imitation of Mohawk warriors. Not to fool anyone, to send a message, bold, unmistakable, defiant. The deadline had passed. Boston would answer not with words, but with resolve. As twilight deepened over Boston on December 16, 1773, the quiet streets began to stir. Figures emerged from alleys and homes, ordinary men in rough cloaks and smeared faces, slipping through the shadows. Their disguise wasn't for deception. It was symbolic a shedding of identities, a declaration of resistance. Dozens made their way to Griffin's Wharf, where the ships Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver sat quietly at anchor. The harbour churned with the cold, black bite of winter. No shouting, no chaos. This was no drunken riot. It was a mission executed with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets and clubs, they swarmed the decks, quickly overwhelming the few crew members still aboard. No one was harmed. The sailors stood aside, silent, uncertain, watching. The men got to work. Wooden tea chests were smashed open with sharp, practiced blows. The fragrance of fresh tea filled the cold air as crate after crate, 342 in total, was hoisted overboard. The splashes echoed like cannon fire across the still waters of Boston Harbor. Tea leaves fanned out like seaweed, swirling in dark mats. Onlookers watched silently from the wharf. British guards nearby made no move to intervene. Whether paralyzed by confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalation, it remains unclear. But even loyalists sensed it. Something had shifted. Discipline held. No cargo was looted, no valuables stolen. Only the teeth symbol of British tyranny was touched. In a city plagued by hunger and hardship, these men could have taken more. They didn't. This wasn't about theft. It was about principle. When it was over, the harbor looked like a giant, swirling cauldron of torn chests and drifting leaves. The salty sea air was laced with the bittersweet sting of tea. The work was done, and then they vanished, into alleyways, into doorways, into the night. No names, no speeches, no claims to glory, only a symbol left behind, mark burned into the soul of a nation to be. Boston held its breath. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a riot. It wasn't an accident. It was an act of cold, calculated defiance under the cloak of night. As dawn broke, the town awoke to a strange smell in the air, briny, smoky, and laced. With T-Dot, the news spread like fire. From baker to blacksmith, apprentice to merchant, everyone knew, and everyone had an opinion. Among patriots, pride, fierce, swelling pride. Ordinary men had stood against the mightiest empire in the world. Among loyalists, horror. To them, this was reckless, dangerous. Had the colonies crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? Governor Thomas Hutchinson raged in his mansion, not just at the destruction of royal property, but at what it signified. If thecking could be defied in Boston, where else might revolution spark? British officials were stunned. They expected protests, maybe a boycott, but not the calm, organized destruction of royal cargo by a disciplined mob. No windows broken, no blood spilled, just tens of thousands of pounds of royalty gone. The captains of the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver could only watch as their cargo vanished into the sea. In the ledgers, the loss was tallied at over £10,000, a staggering fortune. But the real damage wasn't economic. It was political. It was spiritual. That night, trust sank, loyalty cracked, and the illusion of British control died quietly beneath the surface. Because when the tea sank, something else rose. A truth that peaceful protest was ending, that a reckoning was near, and Boston was ready. When word of the Boston Tea Party reached London, it struck like lightning. To the British, it wasn't protest. It was rebellion, a mocking slap across the face of royal authority. King George III reportedly went cold with fury. Parliament exploded in outrage. There would be punishment, not just for Boston, but as a warning to all colonies. And it came swiftly. the Boston port at closing the city's harbor, its economic lifeline, until the tea was paid for. No ships in, no ships out. Trade vanished. The docks fell silent. But they didn't stop there. The Massachusetts government acted the colony of self-governance, placing it under royal control. The administration of justice, killowing British officials accused of crimes to be tried back in Britain. And to drive the message home, British troops were quartered in Boston. Holmes. The message was clear. Rebellion would be crushed. But the effect was the opposite. Across the colonies, anger swelled. The spark had been lit. Boston's harbor may have fallen silent, but its voice now echoed across a continent. And from that black, bitter, tea-stained sea rose the first wave of revolution. Crushed liberty was a luxury the Crown would no longer tolerate, but Parliament's heavy hand had an unintended effect. Instead of frightening the other colonies into submission, it outraged them. News of Boston's suffering its port closed. Its people starving under martial law stirred deep sympathy and righteous anger across the continent. Wagon loads of food and supplies poured into the city from neighboring colonies. Letters of support, pledges of unity, and secret meetings began to weave the once fragmented colonies closer together. What had once been a Massachusetts problem was rapidly becoming an American one. In punishing Boston, Britain had hoped to make an example. Instead, they made Boston a singular rallying cry for resistance. The flames of revolution, once flickering in isolated towns, now began to blaze, colony by colony, and there would be no easy extinguishing them. The punishment of Boston sent shockwaves far beyond the rocky shores of Massachusetts. Across the 13 colonies, outrage transformed into something far more dangerous. Unity. For years, the colonies had acted like distant cousins, bickering, competing, and separated by geography, religion, and trade rivalries. But when Parliament slammed Boston's harbor shut and stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance, Americans across the land realized, if it could happen to Boston, it could happen to anyone. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, from South Carolina to New Hampshire, the response was swift. Colonists sent food, supplies, and letters of solidarity to the suffering Bostonians. Town meetings buzzed with anger. Newspaper printers worked through the night to spread the news. The fight was no longer Boston's alone. It was everyone's. And so, in September 1774, something unprecedented happened. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. For the first time, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered under one roof to discuss a unified response. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, merely regional figures now, stood side by side as architects of a movement that was growing larger by the day. Their goal, at least officially, was not yet full independence. Most still hoped for reconciliation, for a return to the old relationship of mutual respect under the British Crown. But beneath the polite debates and carefully worded petitions, a deeper understanding was taking root. The colonies could no longer afford to stand separately. At the Congress, they agreed to a sweeping boycott of British goods. They pledged mutual support in the face of future aggression. And they made one thing clear: an attack on one colony would be considered an attack on all. In taverns and meeting houses across the continent, ordinary people began using words that had once been whispered only in secret: unity, resistance, liberty. By bringing the hammer down on Boston, Britain had imagined it would crush rebellion. Instead, it had welded the colonies into something far more dangerous: a people who, despite their differences, were beginning to think of themselves not as subjects, not as scattered provinces, but as Americans. The winds of revolution were no longer just stirring, they were gathering into a storm, and it was too late for Britain to stop it. The night the tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't just crates that were destroyed, was an illusion. The illusion that the American colonies could remain loyal subjects forever. The Boston Tea Party lit a spark no king, nor me, and no distant parliament could snuff out. In the months that followed, that spark caught fire. What had once been protests, boycotts, and polite petitions hardened into open resistance. Town militias began drilling openly. Storehouses filled with powder and shot. Men who had once toasted King George III in taverns now whispered about revolution beneath the same roofs. Boston became a symbol of sacrifice, battered but unbowed. And the more Britain tried to tighten its grip, the more the colonies slipped through its fingers. Every ship that sailed past the silent, shuttered harbor of Boston was a quiet reminder. Tyranny had met its match in American defiance. When Parliament passed the intolerable acts, they intended to make an example of Boston. Instead, they created a martyr city, a rallying cry from Georgia to New Hampshire. Colonists realized their fates were tied together. Resistance was no longer about tea. It was about survival, identity, freedom. By the spring of 1775, tension reached a boiling point. Outside Boston, in the villages of Lexington and Concord, British troops sent to seize colonial weapons instead found armed farmers, ordinary men ready to defend their rights with musket fire. The first shots of the American Revolution rang out. A direct line can be traced back to that moment in Boston Harbor when men chose principle over profit and dumped a fortune's worth of tea into the sea. The Boston Tea Party showed the world that revolution doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it starts quietly with a small group of determined people standing in the cold, choosing defiance over fear. In dumping the tea, the colonists weren't just rejecting a tax, they were rejecting an empire. And though the road ahead would be bitter, bloody, and uncertain, one thing had become unmistakably clear that night in Boston Harbor. The American colonies were no longer loyal subjects. They were something new, something dangerous. They were revolutionaries, and they were just getting started. Across the strange weathered mounds scattered across the valley, early explorers saw nothing but nature's forgotten sculptures, mere hills, they thought, shaped by centuries of desert winds. No one imagined that buried beneath the sand lay one of the oldest cities in the world, predating even those civilizations the history books had long crowned as the firsts. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists, led by Ruth Shady, uncovered the truth. What they found buried in the dust of time would rewrite the story of the Americas and force the world to reconsider everything it thought it knew about the birth of civilization itself. Carroll had risen, flourished, and fallen in complete anonymity. And now, after millennia of silence, its stones are speaking again, whispering of a peaceful, intelligent people who built a world of complexity and wonder, in a land where life itself once seemed impossible. And this was only the beginning of their story. At first glance, the Soup Valley looks like a place where life should struggle to exist. Harsh winds sweep across endless stretches of sand and stone. The sun beats down mercilessly, drying out the earth, baking the land into cracked, brittle sheets. Water is scarce. The river a meandering thread fights for survival. To the untrained eye, it is a wasteland, barren, empty, forgotten by the gods. But the people of Carol saw something different. They didn't see a desert to be feared, saw a canvas to be shaped. They recognized the river, however modest, as the lifeblood of possibility. And so, with patience, ingenuity, and sheer determination, they turned this unforgiving place into a thriving oasis of life and culture. Their first great victory: agriculture. They learned to tame the river's seasonal floods, building simple but brilliant irrigation systems that channeled water across the valley floor. Where others saw only dust, they coaxed green shoots of hope: cotton, beans, squash, guava, and sweet potatoes. Cotton, in particular, became their treasure, spun into fishing nets and textiles that fueled trade with distant coastal villages. Through this trade, bonds were formed, bonds that stretched far beyond their desert home. But growing crops was only part of their mastery. The people of Carol understood that survival in the desert required balance. They worked with nature against it. They built their homes and plazas from stone and earth, designed to endure both the punishing heat and the rare but brutal rains that sometimes swept through the valley. They studied the stars and seasons, planning their harvests with the precision of master astronomers. Trade became the veins and arteries of Carol's economy. Dried fish, cotton, fruits, and handmade goods flowed up and down the coast. In exchange, Carol received exotic shells from the Pacific, rare stones from the Andes, and ideas from distant peoples. They were not isolated, they were connected. In a land where survival seemed impossible, Carol thrived through intelligence, innovation, and community. They didn't conquer the desert with brute force, they partnered with it, learned its rhythms, and respected its power. And in doing so, they built a society that was not just functionally, it was extraordinary. Against the odds, Carol blossomed into a beacon of civilization, and it was only beginning to rise. Rising out of the desert like ancient guardians, the pyramids of Carol defy everything we thought we knew about early civilization in the Americas. These were not crude structures built by primitive hands. They were massive, deliberate works of architecture created by a people with vision, organization, and ambition. The centerpiece of the city was the pyramid, Mayartha, largest of Carol's monumental structures. It stretched over 450 feet in length and towered nearly 60 feet above the desert floor. A feat of engineering on par with the early wonders of the ancient world. Built from stone, mud, and woven red bags filled with rocks, the pyramid was designed not just to endure, theclamate, but to survive the punishing earthquakes that sometimes shook the region. And endure it did, standing silent against wind and time for nearly 5,000 years. But the pyramids of Carol were not tombs. Unlike the massive burial complexes of Egypt, Carol's pyramids served a different purpose. They were centers of ceremony, power, and public life. Temples and gathering spaces crowned their summits. Accessible by broad, elegant staircases, fires once burned atop these platforms. Rituals were held beneath the endless Peruvian sky. At the foot of the pyramids, vast plazas opened up, sunken and circular, inviting thousands to gather for religious ceremonies, political meetings, and communal celebrations. The very layout of Carol's cityscape suggests a society that prized unity and order, a people deeply connected to Nineveh and to the cosmos. Around the pyramids, smaller residential complexes fanned outward, likely home to priests, administrators, artisans, and farmers. And the pyramids themselves, they appear to have been aligned with celestial events, solstices, and the cycles of the stars. To the people of Carol, architecture wasn't just practical. It was spiritual, mathematical, cosmic, walking. Among the weathered stones today, it's nearly impossible not to feel a strange, haunting awe. These structures were raised without metal tools, without the wheel, without beasts of burden. Yet they rose with symmetry, with scale, with staggering precision. The great pyramids of Caral were not monuments to ego. They were not built for war. They were built to connect earth and sky, community and cosmos, and humanity and eternity. And they still whisper across the sand, telling a story that refuses to be forgotten. Among the ruins of Caral, something becomes clear. Something different, something profound. No weapons have been found buried beneath its sands. No defensive walls encircle its plazas. No mass graves hint at bloody conquest or civil war, unlike the kingdoms that rose and fell through violence. Caral was a society built on peace, and that revelation defies every expectation. Here was a civilization that flourished not through conquest, but through cooperation, through trade, through shared belief. The people of Caral poured their energy not into armies or battlements, but into architecture, astronomy, music, and communal life. Their plazas and pyramids were not trophies of victory. They were symbols of celebration, of worship, of unity. This was a civilization that chose to gather rather than conquer, to negotiate rather than destroy. Trade was the lifeblood of Caral's success. Cotton, grown along the fertile riverbanks, was spun into fishing nets. Those nets were exchanged with coastal communities for dried fish, a vital source of protein. In return, Caral welcomed exotic goods from distant lands, colorful shells from the Pacific, polished stones from the mountains, and ideas that traveled far and wide. Caral was not the footnote of history, it was the prologue, a glimpse into what civilization can be, not when it is driven by war, but when it is guided by wisdom, connection, and peace. And even now, buried beneath millennia of silence, the story of Caral still speaks. Precious stones from the highlands and rare tropical fruits from distant valleys flowed through an intricate network of trade, binding communities across vast regions into a peaceful web of mutual exchange. At the heart of this web stood Caral, a thriving cultural and economic hub where cooperation, not conquest, defined prosperity. Religious and ceremonial life played a central role in maintaining social harmony. The city's expansive plazas and sunken circular courts weren't merely architectural marvels, they were living stages for collective ritual. In these sacred spaces, spiritual beliefs united the people. Music echoed through the desert air. Flutes carved from condor and pelican bones, drums stretched with deer hides, and whistles made from antlers filled the gatherings with haunting, resonant soundscapes that connected individuals to something far beyond themselves. Leadership in Caral did not revolve around military might. There are no signs of fortifications or weapons of war. Instead, authority appeared to stem from spiritual guidance and civic organization. Coordinating massive construction projects, managing agricultural cycles, and maintaining vast trade relations required foresight, diplomacy, and trust, not domination. In an ancient world so often shaped by the violence of empire, Caral offers a striking counter-exemplar civilization, built not on bloodshed, but on the quiet strength of cooperation. Even today, the stones of Caral seem to hum with echoes of its spiritual rhythm. This was not merely a city of walls, and Market it was a living symphony. Archaeologists, carefully brushing through layers of sand and time, have uncovered a remarkable array of ancient instruments. These were no idle toys. They were finely tuned tools of communication, intentionally crafted to project music across open plazas. In a society without written language, music became the voice of the collective soul. Imagine it, as the sun dipped behind the desert ridges, the deep pulse of drums would rise into the dusk. The flutes would keen like wind sweeping across the plains. Feet would stamp in harmony on the plaza stones as hundreds gathered. Fires flickered atop the stepped pyramids, while priests draped in intricately woven garments chanted invocations to the gods of river, earth, and sky. In those twilight hours, Carroll became more than a settlement. It became a heartbeat and ancient pulse that bridged earth and cosmos. The very layout of the city reflects this spiritual centrality. The sunken, circular courts functioned as acoustic amphitheaters, focusing sound and vision toward the center where rituals unfolded. The pyramids, built not as tombs but as sacred monuments, rose like man-made mountains, linking the terrestrial with the celestial. These structures aligned with solstices and celestial events, turning the entire city into a kind of terrestrial observatory where sacred timing guided everything from planting to pilgrimage. Remarkably, there is no iconography of war in Carroll, no murals of battle, no depictions of violent gods, no sacrificial altars stained with blood. Instead, the art and artifacts speak of reverence, music, fertility, and cosmic order. The spiritual world in Carroll was not one of fear and domination. It was one of celebration, continuity, and connection. Even now, as desert winds whistle through the ruins, one can almost hear the faint echoes, the lost songs of a people who found beauty and meaning in the stark, endless sands. But Carroll wasn't only a place of ritual and music, it was also a stunning feat of engineering. In one of the harshest climates on Earth, without the wheel, without metal tools or beasts of burden, its people shaped a city of enduring stone and earth. Their methods were ingenious. Massive pyramids were constructed with enormous stones carried in red woven bags, strong enough to transport heavy loads. The interiors were filled with layers of rubberlan, early form of structural reinforcement, that helped the pyramids resist collapse. Even more impressive, Carroll lies in a seismically active zone, prone to powerful earthquakes. Yet its pyramids and plazas have survived for nearly 5 millennia. How? Through sophisticated earthquake-resistant architecture. Builders employed wide foundations, layered infill, and rounded corners that flexed and absorbed tremors. Construction techniques born not from formal science, but from generations of intuitive understanding of the Earth's behavior. Water management was another quiet triumph. Though nestled in an arid desert, Carroll flourished thanks to carefully engineered irrigation systems. Canals and channels directed precious river water toward crops, sustaining agriculture even in dry seasons. Every drop mattered, and none was wasted. The city's urban planning was no less advanced. Its major structures were aligned with astronomical phenomena, marking solstices and stellar movements, vital for timing agriculture. These alignments weren't decorative. They served as celestial calendars. The layout of ceremonial centers, administrative zones, and residential areas reflected a balanced society that respected both the sacred and the civic. Carroll wasn't built for rulers alone, it was built for people, for ritual, for legacy. Today, as modern engineers and architects study Carroll's resilience, they are reminded that progress doesn't always come from conquest or complexity. Sometimes, true greatness lies in harmony with nature, with one another, and with time itself. Carroll's stones have endured quakes, storms, and centuries of erosion. They remain not as ruins of failure, but as monuments to enduring human vision, For centuries, Carroll thrived. A city of peace, trade, sound, and structure. And then quietly, mysteriously it was abandoned. No signs of invasion, no fire-scarred ruins, no mass graves, just silence. Why did they leave? That question still lingers over the Soup Valley. Some scholars believe environmental change played a key role. A prolonged drought may have devastated agriculture, and without the river's nourishing waters, the land could no longer sustain its people. Trade, dependent on surplus cotton and agricultural abundance, would have dwindled. A slow unraveling, not a cataclysm. Others suggest that Carroll was not destroyed but transformed. Perhaps the society evolved, its needs changing. People may have dispersed into smaller communities, carrying Carroll's wisdom with them. A graceful departure, rather than a violent end. Whatever the reason, Carroll's story is not one of collapse, but of legacy. It teaches us that civilization can rise on cooperation rather than conquest. That music, ritual, and reverence can bind people as powerfully as any sword. That human beings, even in a harsh and unforgiving land, can build something that echoes for 5,000 years. And perhaps that's Carroll's most lasting message. In a world that so often worships might and forgets memory, it is the quiet civilizations, the ones that listen, that build, that harmonize with the earth, that endure a longness for millennia. Carroll lay forgotten, buried beneath the silent sands of the Soup Valley. Travelers passed the strange rounded hills that dotted the landscape, never suspecting what lay beneath. To them, these were nothing more than natural formations, mounds, sculpted by wind and time. But hidden below was the heart of a lost civilization, older even than the pyramids of Egypt. It wasn't until the late 20th century that Carroll would find its voice again. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Soup Valley, driven by a quiet curiosity and a growing suspicion that these hills hid something extraordinary. What they found would rewrite the story of human civilization. In the Americas, layer by painstaking layer, the sand was brushed away, and from beneath it emerged walls of precisely cut stone, grand staircases, sunken plazas, and pyramids, monuments, not just of survival, but of imagination. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the unthinkable. Carroll was over 4,600 years old. It had thrived alongside the first cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The discovery shook the foundations of archaeology. Until then, most believed that civilization in the Americas bloomed much later, overshadowed by the empires of the Old World. But Carroll changed everything. It proved that the Americas, too, had birthed monumental architecture, complex social organization, and urban life independently, and far earlier than anyone had dared to imagine. Ruth Shady and her team didn't just uncover stone and rubble, they unearthed the remnants of life, musical instruments, fishing nets, woven textiles, quipu knot records, and offerings made to the gods. Each artifact whispered stories of a people who built a society rooted in harmony, ritual, intelligence, and trade. Carroll's rediscovery was more than an academic triumph. It was a resurrection. A civilization that had slept beneath the desert for 4,000 years now stood revealed beneath the open sky once more. Its plazas kissed again by the same winds that once carried the sounds of flutes and children's laughter. Today, Carroll is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site Fragile, priceless link to humanity's earliest dreams of building, belonging, and believing. The sands had hidden Carroll well, but in the end, the stones endured. waiting for someone. To listen, to see, to remember. And yet, we still ask, how does a city so advanced, so beautifully crafted, simply vanish? Some say the fragile balance between human settlement and a harsh environment eventually tipped beyond repair. Others point to shifting trade routes as new centers of power emerged inland and along the coast. Carroll's influence may have waned. The goods it once traded, cotton, fish, and produce perhaps, were no longer enough to sustain its central role. Still others whisper of internal decline. Without written records, we can only imagine political struggles, religious unrest, or simple exhaustion. Even the most peaceful societies can fracture under pressure. Even the wisest can falter when survival grows uncertain. Whatever the cause, the end seems to have come not with a crash, but with a long, quiet sigh. Families likely drifted away one by one, seeking greener valleys, stronger rivers, and new beginnings. Children who once ran across Carroll's plazas grew up telling stories of the city left behind, stories that slowly faded into legend. The desert reclaimed what humans had built. Winds carried fine sand over stone temples. Flutes lay buried beneath the dunes, and what was once a vibrant civilization became a field of silent, sleeping mounds. But now, Carroll stands once again silent, yes, but speaking. Among its pyramids and plazas, the ancient stones whisper a different vision of what civilization can be. A society that raised pyramids without the wheel, that mapped the stars without writing, that flourished without the scars of war. A society rooted in music, ritual, engineering, and community, not conquest. In an age often defined by domination, Carroll offers a rare counterpoint, a civilization that chose connection over conquest, knowledge over power. It reminds us that complexity does not require violence, that greatness is not measured by armies or empires, but by how a people come together to build, to create, to dream. Carroll's legacy stretches far beyond the dry sands of the Soup Valley. It challenges the old belief that civilization had only one cradle. It proves that human aspiration, our drive to understand, to organize, to express beauty, arose in many corners of the earth, shaped by different hands but stirred by the same eternal longings to endure, to celebrate, to reach for the divine. And today, walking among Carroll's weathered ruins, you can almost hear it still, the pulse of drums, the murmur of traders, the echo of flutes drifting over stone, and the laughter of children under a sky of endless stars. Their dreams are not lost. Their stories are not gone. They are etched into the bones of the earth. Carroll teaches us this. Even when civilizations fall, their spirit can endure, sleeping under the sands, waiting to be remembered, waiting to inspire once more. In the great timeline of human history, Carroll shines not only as a relic of the past, but also as a beacon for the future. A reminder that even in the harshest deserts, even beneath the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root and build a world that dares to reach for the stars. If you believe history isn't just about dates and battles but lost cities, hidden truths, and untold stories, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to History Nest and join us as we uncover the forgotten, the mysterious, and the awe-inspiring past that still echoes through time. Hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and help us bring history back to life.